come to the final week of our Half-Truth series. And so over this past month or so, if you've been with us, then you've been hearing how we've been exploring some of the phrases that were lifted up in the video that you just saw. Some of these phrases may have been really challenging for some of you. I know that I challenged myself, especially in these types of series. But today, perhaps, may be the most challenging of them all. Love the sinner, hate the sin. Now, there are certain situations, I was thinking as I was crafting the beginning of my sermon, about certain situations where this phrase might be appropriate. So I thought I would share them with you. I think it might be quite useful for those who are dealing with road rage. If someone cuts you off on the highway, having love the sinner, hate the sin as a mantra in your head may help bring your blood pressure down and bring calm to your heart. Or if you are the parent of a young child and your child does something they know they are not supposed to do, but they do it anyways to test the limits and boundaries that they have never tested before in life, then love the sinner, hate the sin is a good reminder, just as it is a good reminder for Calvin's dad, too, in this comic. It's okay to laugh. I thought it was funny. I hear some giggles. It's okay to let it out. Help me out here. We hear this phrase a lot in church life, in church circles. And it seems innocent. It seems like something that Jesus would even tell us to do. It sounds like it comes from the Bible. Jesus calls us to hate sin, and Jesus also calls us to love. And so we use the phrase in a variety of situations. We say, or we might say or think, I love him, but I hate his addiction. I love them, but I hate the way they overeat. I love her, but I don't agree with her lifestyle. Or I love him, but I don't agree with his relationship. What's interesting is that I don't think that I've heard anyone say, love the sinner, hate the sin, by saying, I love you, but I hate your sin. You know, we usually have a tendency to say it when we're talking about another person and their sin. And I've never heard it used in any conversation that is productive or that actually stops someone from sinning. This week, our scripture that I've chosen comes from the Gospel of Matthew. Last week, we read from the same gospel, and this is a couple chapters later, and it's still in what has become known as Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Now, right before what I'm going to share with you all, Jesus teaches all of those who have gathered for this sermon about worrying, and he assures them, his audience, of the ways that God will take care of them. This is what he says. Do not judge so that you may not be judged. For with the judgment you make, you will be judged. And the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye, while the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite! First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. So it really makes sense. After Jesus tells them not to worry about what the future holds, like he does before this passage, he tells them to not worry about where their next food or their clothing will come from. And then it makes sense that his next instruction is, do not judge. Because in reality, judgment usually comes from a place of privilege. If I am assured that God loves me, then it's easy for me to say, I am loved and forgiven, and so let me now tell others how I think they should live. Jesus knew his disciples would have a tendency to take all that they had learned from Jesus and to use it to point the finger at other people. So he is clear in his teaching that God is the only judge, and he tells them the hard truth, that the one who judges really has more sin going on in their own life than the big sin of the one that they are judging. When there's a log in your eye, it's really difficult to take out the little speck or the splinter that's in the eye of the one that you are judging. Though we still like to try to do that, though. And usually it ends up looking like this. Luke writes a very similar teaching of Jesus in his gospel, and he says that the blind can't lead the blind, which I think is a little more relatable to our language. You know, when we are called to walk together, God then is our judge and our leader. I think if we continue to follow Jesus and look at the teaching in Jesus' life, we see how hurtful this phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin, really can be. So I want to break it down a little bit. First, when we look throughout what is recorded of Jesus' life in our Gospels, nowhere is it recorded that Jesus said, love the sinner. Instead, Jesus said, love your neighbor and love your enemies. Calling your neighbor or your enemy a sinner is pretty redundant because we're all sinners, right? Jesus chose his words very carefully and very wisely, I believe, because if he had told his followers to love the sinner, then they, as we do, would begin looking at others more as sinners than as neighbors, which would then, of course, lead to judgment. So if our focus is on loving the sinner instead of the neighbor, then all that we're going to do is focus on someone else's sin instead of someone else's humanity. So first, Jesus never said, love the sinner. And second, Jesus focused a lot more on forgiveness than he focused on sin. Jesus was a friend to those whom society deemed as sinners. Timothy wrote in his letter about how Jesus came to save sinners. But the thing about Jesus is that when he spoke to others that were labeled as sinners, he never talked to them about their sin. Instead, he focused on forgiveness. In Luke, Jesus tells the parable about a Pharisee and a tax collector. So the Pharisee, on the one hand, in this story, prays about himself, and he thanks God that he is not a sinner like the crooks and the prostitutes and the tax collectors. And then, in the same parable, Jesus talks about the tax collector on the other side. And back then, if you didn't know, tax collectors were really labeled as sinners and crooks, and many people did not like them. They were outcast in society, made a lot of money, but were outcast. So Jesus says that this tax collector stands in a distance from this Pharisee, and he doesn't even point his eyes to heaven when he says, God, show mercy on me, a sinner. So he's comparing these two different prayers, and Jesus says that the tax collector was more justified than the Pharisee that day, because the one who placed himself up high was lowered, and the one who humbled himself, like the tax collector did, was lifted up. You see, Jesus loved people in such a way that they didn't want to sin anymore. From Jesus' friendship, they knew their mess. They knew the ways that they had gone wrong, and they were attracted to Jesus because of the forgiveness that he showed. And I think that instead of seeing everyone as a sinner, Jesus saw everyone as a child of God, worthy of forgiveness and love. When we see someone under a label, it's hard for us to love them. So some of you still might be thinking you might want to push back a little bit. And as I've said through this series, you are welcome to push back. We could have conversations later about this. But some of you may be pushing back thinking, shouldn't we still be hating sin? The second part of the phrase. And yes, we should still absolutely hate sin. We should hate sins that harm and oppress other people, like racism and injustice, human trafficking, abuse. We should have righteous anger about those in our world who are oppressed. If you join this church as a disciple or any United Methodist church, you take a vow to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. It's a vow we take when we join the United Methodist Church. So if somebody is seriously harming themselves or another person, then we shouldn't be quiet about it. Our love for someone, then, may spur us on to conversation from a place of concern and care about sin that is truly harmful. And when those conversations are spirit-led, they can be healing and they can be life-giving. Jesus focused more on forgiveness than sin, but then he led people and told them not to sin anymore. And I don't discount any of that. However, I have never heard anyone use the phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin, under situations of oppression or abuse or harm. I hear it much more in situations about the character or the identity of another person or the lifestyle of another person. So often, we hate the things we believe are the sins of another that have no effect on our lives whatsoever. I want to give you a little example from my own story. I went to seminary in Washington, D.C., and it was Wesley Seminary, which is a pretty small seminary, and it had an even smaller community of full-time students who lived together on campus. Now, I was part of that campus community because living in D.C. is expensive. Most people who lived on campus went straight from college into seminary. I had a few years outside of college, not living in a dorm, and so I was named the grandma of the dorm because I didn't want to stay up until 2 o'clock in the morning eating pizza. I wanted to go to bed and for everyone to be quiet. But in that community, relationships on campus were close. And then when relationships became romantic, everyone knew about it, right? We were all there living together. It wasn't odd for someone on Wesley's campus to meet and marry their spouse all within 3 years' time of school. We would say there's something in the water for those that did that all so quickly. There was a tendency, though, for some of us to spend a large amount of time talking about the relationships of others as if they knew what was best for a certain person or a certain couple. And I would participate in those conversations. We would criticize my one friend who every semester, without fail, would search for and then ask a girl out from the new incoming class. Every semester, searching for the one, right? We would also criticize the ways couples acted in public or the amount of time that they'd spend with each other instead of with groups of friends. And it wasn't until I was in a serious relationship of my own with my now husband that I realized how hurtful those kinds of conversations were to the people that were in the center of them. Though we loved the people that we talked about, our conversations weren't filled with compassion or support. They were filled with gossip and envy and judgment. And maybe my story sounds like something that is only in college or young adult circles. You know, it was over 10 years ago in my life. But really, I think it's everywhere. The situations might just change. The topic of conversation might just change as we get older. When we start having conversations about what we deem is or is not sinful, or what is or is not right for someone else based on our own bias and our own insecurities, and not really about the harm that another person is doing to someone else, it's dangerous. In these moments, Jesus is calling us to look at our own lives and the places in ourselves where sin is still present, and to ask God to transform us and to work on us. Often, our lives are so filled with such a big mess that we'd rather clean up the mess of our neighbor than to take care of our own lives. I know, because it happened to me. I wanted to focus on the things that I thought were the sins of my friends in relationships because I was dealing with the awful sin of jealousy, and I didn't want to fix that in my own life. Only God decides the work that Jesus does to heal us. We don't get to decide that. We don't get to play the middleman between Christ and another human being. Billy Graham was once quoted as saying, "It's the Holy Spirit's job to convict, it's God's job to judge, and it's our job to love." And I think if we really practiced that, then there would be a lot more mercy in this world that is so quick to jump on the shortcomings of others. I really wholeheartedly believe that God does God's work of healing and transforming lives, and God does it through love. There's one more large reason why I think love the sinner, hate the sin should be dropped from our vocabulary. This attitude of loving the sinner and hating the sin keeps young people away from church. Now, we have many young people here today brought by their parents, but there are many millennials, my generation, and Generation Z that are turned off from communities of faith because of Christians that have this attitude of judgment. And they don't even need to go to church because of it. Some of them have just written off church completely. They didn't grow up in it, maybe because of their parents, and they don't want to return to it or even go to it at all because they hear it in many other spaces that they see on social media or from people who claim to be Christians while casting their view on who is and isn't a sinner. They don't have to come to church to find that. We may not agree with how someone else lives, but again, our job is to love. And when we don't love, then our churches become places filled with people who have logs in their eyes and don't want to do anything about it. My friends, I want you to know that I don't believe that we are that church. You all have hearts that are full of compassion and love. Yesterday, you may have seen on our Facebook page, our leadership council spent the day in a retreat, an all-day retreat, to vision and dream about the future. And we had a great facilitator who is a pastor and leader in our conference, and she led us through our time together discussing our DNA as a congregation in light of all of the changes of the past 5 to 7 years that we've been through. And so this is some of the things that we talked about, that were lifted up. We talked about our connectionalism and our open doors. We talked about our resilience and our willingness to change. We talked about our welcome of children and youth. And I loved one phrase that was written down in our discussion, so I wrote it down too, so I wouldn't forget it. We are a church on the front lines, having the courage to create space for others. We are a church on the front lines, having the courage to create space for others. So let's tell a different story. Our actions and our words have the power to show that because of the love of Jesus, there is something different about us. And maybe you can tell that story with your words or with your actions in your workplace or at your bus stop or in the lunchroom. Maybe you'll tell it through the Easter cantata this year or in one of the ways that you serve on a regular basis. Maybe you can tell that story around planning tables that we're going to have to see how we can embody more of that front line thinking, being on the front line of the community in events like the Easter egg scramble or this summer life camp that we want to make some changes to welcome more of the community in, where we can create meaningful moments on those front lines and create space for others in our community who desperately need, just like all of us, connectionalism and love. And they can find it in a community of faith like us. Friends, my prayer is that we would love others despite the fact that we're all sinners. We have the power to lean so far, I believe, into the business of love that there isn't any ounce of judgment left in us. And I pray that would be so and would be our story.